In the bleak midwinter, frosty wind made snow and all that stuff. Welcome to January in the UK, where we've had a particularly cold snap of weather, and people I've noticed online and people I know who grow some of the tender plants are a bit concerned about what they can do with their cordylines, their tree ferns and other kind of tender trees or plants. So in this video we're going to have a look at some of the things that you can do to mitigate any damage that might occur through cold weather to some of those kind of semi-exotic tender plants. Come with me and we'll go and have a look together. And if you needed evidence that we've got some cold weather at the moment, here's what was on top of the bird bath about 4 or 5 hours ago when we first got up, and my wife slipped it off the top so that the birds had somewhere to kind of bathe or to drink. Oh dear. And since then you can see it's frosted over again. So we are having some unusually cold weather, but actually I think that's good. I think that's, it's normal. I think a bit of frost on the ground kills off a few bugs, and it just feels right that we should have some cold weather in winter, and it's actually beautiful when you get some blue sky and a bit of sunshine. Whee, there it is, a bit of winter sun. But how are these plants coping with this weather? Because obviously these aren't native. Although my last video, if you want to have a look, we were asking the question about these cordylines, which are thriving here in the UK in many gardens. At what point do they become? Well, I asked the question, could they become native? But actually, I was corrected. Thank you to everyone who kind of joined the conversation there, and we arrived at a word called naturalized. So they seem to do well, and they've kind of naturalized, and but they're not native, and it would take maybe a million years or two for them to be possibly considered native. However, how are they coping with this cold weather, and what are we doing to protect these plants? Well, I can tell you first of all that this chap here, this glorious, majestic Trachycarpus fortunei, I have never protected in the 20 odd years that we've had it in our garden. He's never had any protection whatsoever. That will take minus 15, possibly more. The cordylines there, I've never protected, and we have had minus 8s, minus 9s, and they've come through it okay. If we had a really cold spell of weather, and by that I mean where it is frozen, seriously cold day and night, then they might suffer. And I walked around here because that cordyline there was the first cordyline that I ever grew, and going back to the 1980s, 1985 I think it was, we had a really cold winter, and it was prolonged for about a month, the whole of February. The ground was frozen solid, and that was a young cordyline at the time, about 2 meters, 6 foot high in my previous garden, and the whole thing just collapsed down to the ground, and it looked effectively dead. There was just a pile of pulp, dead leaves basically on the ground in this kind of soggy, mushy mess. And I didn't have time in the spring to kind of replace it. So in the summer of that year, then I thought, right, I'm going to go and dig that patch over and replant another cordyline. And I was just about to stick the spade into the ground when I saw a tiny little shoot just starting to grow out from beneath the ground. And now 40 odd years later, it's still going strong, and it's moved 2 gardens since then. So these cordylines can suffer in prolonged cold spells, particularly if it's frozen during the day and during the night. But they can also regenerate, and you know, you can start again, and they grow back very, very quickly actually. I think the measure to kind of bear in mind is if it's a bit of frost overnight, that's quite normal. So if, over the last few weeks we've had kind of, I don't know, -2, -3 overnight, and then it's gone up to kind of 3 or 4 degrees. I'm talking Celsius here. It's gone up to 3 or 4 degrees above freezing during the day, and they're fine with that because they get a bit cold overnight, but then they kind of thaw out and they can breathe, and the roots can operate normally. They can live during the day and then get a bit of a chill overnight. So I particularly like it when we get a little bit of very, very light frost in the autumn, maybe in November, October, November, which helps to toughen up the leaves, stops them growing. What you don't want is these cordylines putting on lots of soft growth in the late autumn, and that soft growth then will be more vulnerable if we get a hard spell in the winter. So one of the tips I would give people who are growing slightly tender plants like the cordylines is to, if you're going to use a high nitrogen feed, which will encourage lots of lush new leaf, only do that, only apply that sort of fertilizer in the spring, early spring. So about March time here in the UK, March, April. So that will encourage lots of new growth at the right time of the year in the spring, which will then have the summer and the autumn to kind of ripen off and toughen up a bit, ready for the autumn. As you will probably know from any videos, if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I tend to favour high potash fertilizers, balanced feeds that have got nitrogen, but they've got a larger quantity of potash in there, and you can have a look at the back of the fertilizer packet and it'll tell you what the percentage nitrogen and the percentage potash is. I always tend to use fertilizers that have a higher potash content. So typically it might be, I don't know, 12% potash, whereas it might only be 6, 7, 8% nitrogen. That means that the growth that I get won't be quite so soft. It'll have an element of potash, because potash, amongst many other things, helps toughen up the cell walls and helps the plant produce tough growth. It's a bit like if you look at lawn fertilizer. Lawn fertilizer in the summer will be high nitrogen to encourage lots of new growth in the spring, summer, but then the autumn lawn fertilizer will have a higher potash content because you don't want lots of soft, lush new growth in the winter. So it's the same principle. So there's a really important thing you can do is just be careful what fertilizers you use and when you use them. Don't be feeding high nitrogen feeds going into the autumn or winter. I'll do a summary of all the kind of the key points at the end of this video, and I'll put it in the description as well. The other thing that you can do is, a bit like us, is position your tender plants so that they catch the kind of the midday sun. So as you can see here, all these cordylines and the Trachycarpus and our tree fern down there are exposed to the kind of the warmest part of the day. Having said that, let's kind of look at our tree fern. Our tree fern does get a bit more shade through part of the day. I mean, tree and ferns, you know, very often like a bit of shade. So this fig tree and that cordyline, and we've got another tree like a willow tree just below here, do provide some shade for our tree fern, which actually is much less hardy than the Trachycarpus or the cordylines. And the tender part of the tree fern is right in the core of this plant here. If you can, right at the top of the stem, there we are, you can see the kind of that kind of old woody trunk there with ivy growing over it, and where we've cut fronds and leaves from previous years. So what I've done is through the autumn, and you'll see videos on my channel with more detail on how we actually do this, we've protected the crown of the plant by a mixture of old cut off, trimmed off fern leaves off this plant, and just for the first time this year I've put a bit of this stuff in here. Can you see that? That's sheep's wool that's used as, well, sometimes it's used as a hanging basket liner, or I actually got that from some packaging. Some goods came in to one of the garden centres where I work, and they were protected by a little blanket of this processed sheep's wool. So that's provided a little thermal layer to the kind of the core of the plant there, a little bit of protection, a little blanket to just keep the core of the plant protected from the cold winds. It could be argued that I should have cut off all these other fronds, but if we had some really cold weather, I might do that. But to be honest, as I say, we've had -2, -3, and generally speaking, it's been above freezing during the day. Just these last couple of days, I mean, the temperature now is like 1 or 2 degrees. When you get in the sunshine, let's just do that. Yes, when you get in the sunshine, it actually feels a little bit warmer, but you can see that there's a hint of frost on those bits that are in the shade, and on the top of the hills, when they're shaded, we can see, you know, there's kind of frost around. Some plants, like this Silver Falls basket plant, he's had it. And if we come round here, you can see things like the osteospermum. Now if you come round this side here, you can see that that side of the plant is suffering a little bit more. Maybe it's been exposed to the wind on that side, but actually, if you look more closely, look at that. With my new phone there, focusing, I've got a new iPhone that's got a zoom lens on it, which I've been wanting to invest in for a long time. So you can see that actually the plant may be suffering, but he's not dead. And what I might do come March time is prune right back down to the base of the plant, where you can see there's some new shoots wanting to start. This Canna Lily here, which looked lovely last summer and the summer before, does not look so healthy, and I should have put it into a greenhouse, but I didn't, because last year we had exactly the same symptoms with this. It looked pretty much dead, but in the spring we had some new shoots from the base like that there. So sometimes plants can look dead, but actually, there's another one there. Can you see that? There is life at the bottom there, at the crown of the plant, and sometimes just by having them nearer to the wall of the house there, that can help. They'll get a little bit of warmth, either from the heating of the house, or when the sun sits onto that, comes around and warms up that wall, the kind of the warmth radiates back out from the wall. And look at this little nemesia here, summer bedding plant, trying its best to flower in January. So you just can't tell. So let me just try and recap on some of the things that that you can do to protect your plants. I'm really not keen to suggest that you wrap cordylines and things in plastic bags. That can do as much damage as good. If it's a young cordyline, what I would suggest is you could get some fleece, horticultural fleece, or some of that wool that I showed you earlier on, and wrap that around a cordyline, but only if it's really cold. If you look at that cordyline there, that's quite a young one in that pot. He's had no protection. He's in a nice sunny spot there, not far from the house in that pot. And when he gets into the ground, I'm gonna take him out of that pot and put him into the ground in the spring. He'll shoot away, and once they get, you know, to a good kind of woody trunk on them, they seem to be able to cope with the frost much better. Now I've just spotted this this poor little geranium here, which is a kind of little Mediterranean plant that is really kind of suffering. It's in the shade quite a bit of the day here by that lovely crinodendron, but it's getting a bit of sunlight now for a couple of hours in the afternoon, and you can see it's suffering. It's kind of wilted. The new growth is more tender and is really suffering there. Do you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to move him over towards the house up against the wall and maybe put something underneath the pot so that the excess water drains out a bit more, and I'll see if that helps it, because once again, like we saw earlier on, there is new growth down there. So even though we might lose the top of the plant, it could grow back nice and bushy if we can just keep that kind of base of the plant alive. So I'll show you what I'm going to do in just a moment. There we go. I brought him round to the front of the house here, up against that wall where they get the afternoon and evening sun, so it gets a little bit of warmth from the wall of the house. And can you see underneath there, I've just put 3 stones, equal sized stones, underneath the pot. You can buy pot feet, and we use pot feet on some of our other plants, but they cost money and I haven't got any spare ones at the moment. So I have just put some stones underneath, which just allows any excess moisture to run out. When I lifted up the pot, I could feel it was quite heavy, waterlogged, which is not good. As I said earlier on, any of these tender plants have got more chance of surviving if you can just get some of that excess water draining out and let them be a little bit on the dry side. On a positive note here, of course, just reaching over, ta-da! Spring is coming. Those daffodils that's one called Jetfire, which is a lovely kind of dwarf two-tone orange and yellow miniature daff. Another month or so, 6 weeks, and we should see some colour on them. I think understanding your local climate is important. Understanding what, when I say cold or very cold, what that actually means. If it becomes a prolonged cold spell, then there's more of a concern for these plants. So provide some protection if you really need to. If it's a young plant, the right position, right plant, right place is important. So in a sunny, in our case, south-facing position can help. Well-drained soil can also help. Don't have them waterlogged. They hate being wet and waterlogged. So we've got some really well-draining soil here. We're on the side of the hill, so the water tends to run down, and that means that those roots can breathe. If they get soaking wet and the roots can't breathe and they're frozen, then you've got a problem. And Wales does get a fair bit of rain, so if you're in the UK and you get a lot of rain, then get some good drainage underneath where you plant your cordylines, or plant it in a well-drained area. Cordylines, a little bit of protection when they're young, less protection required the older they get. Trachycarpus, I don't think you've got a real worry with those. They laugh at our cold weather. Tree ferns protect the crown, protect that soft growth right in the middle of the plant. And I think that's about it, really. Bear in mind that plants in pots may suffer more than plants in the ground, because the pot is above ground, and so it's more likely to get frozen. If that pot gets frozen, there could be trouble. Whereas plants in the ground, their roots will be 2 or 3 feet under the ground, the tips, so they tend to have a little bit more protection. That's the other thing you could do. You could mulch with some straw or some bark over the roots of plants like this in the autumn, and that little bit of organic matter will warm up the soil. It will provide a little kind of micro climate almost around the base of the plant to help warm up the roots and protect those roots. In the end, if you can keep the roots alive on any plant, you've got a good chance of it surviving. If the roots die, we're in trouble, because roots are the life support of the plant, aren't they? I hope this all makes sense, and I hope I haven't waffled on too much. I hope you have a grand 2025. And any questions, any comments, as ever, we would love to hear from you via our comments section on YouTube. Thank you very much.